You got a good haircut, by the way.
We're live
I
now.
did it myself. No,
So,
I did.
Yeah. So, hi everybody. We are live, and Adam, I think you're going to be kicking this bad boy off, right?
Welcome to Project Geospatial, everybody. I'm Adam Simmons, and here with me is Talbot Brooks. Here with the episode with the topic of COVID-19, bad cartography or cognitive bias. I want to also reintroduce my co-host, Darryl Murdoch, which is going to help lead the discussion with Talbot. Darryl, take it away.
Great, Adam. Thank you. And Talbot, thanks for joining us today, man. Great seeing you from the lovely state of Mississippi. Actually, Cleveland, Mississippi, home of Charlie Patton and the Delta Blues. For those that you don't know, I've been to the pole barn where Charlie Patton apparently ostensibly grew up, and I went through the tour there. So that was actually a lot of fun being down in Cleveland with you at that time. So for our listeners out there, Talbot is he's got a great background in doing all sorts of really cool stuff that I wish I had on my resume. And we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff today. And he and I were chatting about how some of the maps that we're looking at today on the newscasts and that we see over and over again that are being accessed, are those really telling the kind of story that we really want us to be telling? I mean, is it telling us not only accurately depicting data, but are those data the kinds of data that really tell the full story? So that's part of the discussion today, but it'll probably go in about 100 other directions, because that's kind of what Talbot and I usually do when we get going. One of the things, Talbot, that I'd like to start out with is, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and maybe talk a little bit about kind of the intersection of your FEMA work and your firefighting work? Because when I first met Talbot, and this is what he still does, he introduces himself like this. Hi, I'm Talbot Brooks. I make maps. So you can't use that today. I just want to have a conversation with you and me and Adam about, what's going on and this conversation that you kicked off about cognitive bias.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Darryl. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate the opportunity here to share some thoughts with a broader audience and some of my concerns. My first job actually was as a firefighter, and I'm the fifth generation of my family to do that. And so I've continued that capacity one way or another, working EMS, environmental remote sensing, and then transitioning much more into geospatial technologies. And then when Hurricane Katrina rolled around in 2005, I found myself sitting in the hot seat at the state of Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, mashing on the fly this geospatial background that I had with disaster and crisis management, and trying to do what I later learned was GeoInt for emergency management. And since then, I've spent a lot of time putting together academic programs and doing outreach and education about GeoInt, both for the military DoD community and the international community through work with the United Nations and the disaster and emergency preparedness communities. And that kind of leads us to where we are today, right? Is we've got yet another disaster on our hands called COVID-19. And we have a much different group of practitioners jumping into the fray and trying to describe what's going on through maps, and decision makers trying to look at information and all of that. And so here we are.
Yeah, so you got such a great background and so many different things. And so if you didn't catch that, for our listeners, when Talbot talks about, he was making maps during Hurricane Katrina, he was the guy that was the one that was kicking out the maps that all of us were actually looking at that had to do with Katrina. Nah, you just you always say that. It's like, oh, I was just doing a piece of it. But, so, he's got firsthand experience from a lot of different directions. I'm curious, Talbot, talk to us a little bit about, here we are on the 23rd of April and of 2020. And just this past week, you and Mississippi just had a whole pile of really not so fun weather comes zipping through, right? So, we've got you luckily right now on using your cell phone to be able to get a connection to us because, as to your point, your infrastructure is down. So, I'm really curious. I never see anything reported other than, you see the Weather Channel and, if you see, a couple of folks like Jim Cantori, if he shows up at your doorstep, you're pretty much, it's like having the Grim Reaper show up, right? So I'm curious, right. So, talk to us a little bit about, kind of the aftermath of that. And what is it like being in, we're in COVID-19, and on top of it, you have all of this, disaster and emergency management stuff that has to happen. How do you do that and, stand 6 feet away? I'm talking to my wife about it. And I said, okay, so how do I go rebuild a house? Do I have to hire a family of construction people so they're all living in the same house? How does that, what happens in a case like that?
Yeah. So, just as a first responder, the challenges are incredible because we're used to employing what we used to call universal precautions when dealing with at least medical patients. But to have to carry that to every call that you respond to, and then worry about each other being sick. So the person that you're relying on the most to help keep you safe is your ability to trust that they're completely well and able to do that. That's kind of faded away a little bit too, because you're sitting there going, God, if I got a buddy breathe off this guy because my air pack's out of air, am I going to get COVID-19 because, he has it but doesn't know it yet, and so there's some extra risk factors going on here. In terms of portraying things and what's going on. This is the intersection of multiple disasters happening at the same time in Mississippi. It's not just the response community that's affected. It's um, uh, uh, all of the supporting aspects that go with it. The fellows I feel the worst for actually are the linemen. You want to go out and work in crap weather and you've never worn personal protective equipment, and you're going to have to do that, or you're just going to have to say, I got to get the job done. I'm going to suck it up and take the risk. And frankly, that's what I see a lot of them are doing. And then on the decision maker side of the fence, it's one thing for us we're fairly used to as a community. Sure, here's the map of the tornado track. Here is a bunch of points that show what's damaged at what percent. But then you've got to consider, where am I going to put the displaced people and maintain social distancing? It's just not a question of where do I have shelter anymore. There's another layer of complexity that's come into this, and understanding which communities have been the hardest hit, not just by one disaster, but by the other. And so it's a real opportunity for geospatial analysis, but it starts pushing us into some territory. I've had very little to no training in epidemiology, and the best I can do to map COVID is kind of look at the state data and do my best to represent, what I hear the professionals saying is going on. But then to go into something they've never thought about necessarily or modeled. Okay, let's take a pandemic and then combine it with a flood, and while we're at it, let's run a tornado over the top of it all.
Well, I got one to add to it. You ready? So, one of the other graphics that I've gotten, and we can probably post this later to the broadcast, is actually I was reading an article about we've got the worst in East Africa. We've got the worst locust plagues in decades going on right now, right? So let's add that in on top of all of that, right?
Yeah. Food supplies getting threatened globally through that. Our ability to transport things, it's a whole bunch of mess.
But so your abstract here is fascinating for the premise of the show in bad cartography and cognitive bias, because I've been looking at this over the course of several weeks. I actually had the pleasure of talking with two individuals, Diana Gillian and Katie Zajic, and they're actually cartographers and geospatial analysts locally within the DC region, and they're actually involved in mapping COVID data. And they've brought up similar issues I think we're about to talk about, in that how inaccurate not the maps necessarily, not the data necessarily is, but the representation of this data is in maps. And that's a huge problem. And I'm excited to get into this topic with you and bring to light some of these issues, and understanding what we're actually seeing is some disparity in how it's collected from perhaps one country, one area of the world to another.
Right, and Adam, and I think that leads to the fundamental question that I've been trying to ask is, what is it that we're trying to show in particular? How do we segment that by audience? And are we doing a good job of making sure of how we create those products? Does it align with the message we're trying to send to any particular audience? Or are our own cognitive biases and ways of looking at the world really skewing that, and thus skewing how people react?
So let's pull on that just a little bit, that thread. Can you explain to us, Talbot, what is cognitive bias? Just in your words. Yeah, I know.
I think cognitive bias. I think the easiest way for me to explain cognitive bias is where our own perceptions and understanding of the world interferes with how we relate a story to somebody else. It adds kind of a spin factor to it that may or may not be representative of what's really happening in the real world. At least that's it to students. I know there's a lot more formal definitions, and there's a lot of ways that cognitive bias can come into play. It's broken down into a lot of different types based on stereotypes. I think are probably one of the easiest for people to relate to. Hey, I can find it on Google, so I don't need to learn it. Is another aspect, and I think we see some of that manifesting here as well.
Yeah, I think of cognitive bias, especially in terms of maps, as, are we presenting data that are reflective of the concepts that we're trying to show, but that are not completely colored by the way we see the world, right? So when everything that we have done, Talbot, you've got different life experience than Adam, and a different life experience than me. So all of us come to the table with a different way of looking at the world. So we're going to pick different data sources that we're comfortable with, and different ways of being able to showing things that are more comfortable to us, because that's just our experience. So, cognitive bias has got a lot of that kind of background of, you take all of what Talbot has done over the course of time. And so that's why I at the beginning of our conversation, when we were talking about your emergency management background, I think that's kind of a key piece, because this is an emergency management situation, but it's one that we really haven't ever seen before. Not with people that are still living right now, anyhow.
Right. And as reference for listeners, introducing the problem a little into the crisis disaster management aspect, Marc Monmonier has done a fantastic job with, and it's an old text, How to Lie with Maps, right? Really does a good job of introducing the concept of talking about crisis and how we portray things from a cartographic.
Yeah, I had a number of conversations with Mark when he was. I was up at Syracuse the same time he was teaching there. So, yeah, so it was. It's really there are several other kind of, these are, for those of you that don't have it, you should pick it up. It's actually a really kind of fascinating way of being able to talk about. We'll call it spatial statistics in a lot of ways. Is what he really kind of gets to when he talks about how to lie with maps.
Yeah, and I'll make you feel old quickly, Darryl. He just announced his retirement this semester. So
fabulous, man, and not what we're hoping for. Mark's a great guy, and
Back online with Project Geospatial. I'm Adam Simmons. Once again, we're here with Talbot Brooks and Darryl Murdoch to talk about cognitive bias or bad maps, or bad cartography, I should say, with COVID-19. Talbot, let's continue the discussion what we had. Darryl, take it away.
Yeah, so Talbot, we were talking a little bit about cognitive bias and the fact that there's lots more than just one of them. I think there's over 100 cognitive biases, really. So that's sort of where we left off, and it's all that kind of stew of predisposition and kind of the way we think about the world that really kind of make us think. So maybe you can show us or talk to us a little bit about a couple of the maps that you shared with Adam and me prior to the show that really were kind of at the heart of our discussion.
Yeah, I can do that. And let's see if I'm going to share the right window here, the right screen. Screen one, share. So, can you see this map of the case maps in Mississippi that I've got on screen now?
Stand by. Yes, I can.
Okay. So there's two fundamental pieces of information that I struggle with kind of as a cartographer. And I'm not, please, if you work for the Department of Health in Mississippi, I'm not trying to throw rocks at you. But you notice there's a blue color ramp in play here, right? And so blue is usually thought of as a cool or calming color to use. And so when I first looked at this, I'm like, all right, so is the name of the game here is what they're trying to do is have people look at this map and not get all bent out of shape and we're going to use this calm, cooling color? Or was it just the default that somebody who, knows how to do a join at the county level for data, and this is the default and just what happened to go out? I don't know. I can't answer that, right? But so I was looking at this going, boy, there's the potential for cognitive bias going on here, or at least, and that's on the map maker side. And on the user side, right, when you see this as a user, is that as alarming to you as what you might see if I did the same sort of map like this, like I've made here at home, using a red color ramp? What messages are coming across, and what is the potential for cognitive bias from both the cartographer and from the user's perspective?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the and what you're displaying is the differences in the color mats there between the counties, the different states. And the reason I'm kind of reiterating that is for our audio audience there. And what would you think what would you recommend to map builders out there as something that they should do instead?
Yeah, so I think the best thing we can do is really talk to the professionals on the healthcare side. We need to act as the interpreters, not as necessarily the contributors of information in a lot of cases. The same extends across the disaster and management and emergency response world when I try to make maps in that community as well, and get a sense of the level of urgency of the message that they're trying to send, and then use our cartographic training to match that to what we would see as the cognitive model in play by the audience that they're trying to speak to. So it might be that a blue color ramp is completely appropriate, that the message here is, this isn't as big a deal as everybody's making it out to be, so we're going to tone it down a little here. Or it can be the red of, oh my God, the world's going to end. Let me give you some flashy colors that are kind of set you on edge. And so that choice has to be guided, though, by listening and collecting some kind of consensus from the people who are trying to send the message. I don't see as geospatial professionals that we're necessarily the ones that pick it without having that type of information come to us.
So one of the conversations we had was, there are maps that are currently being used. I think it's Johns Hopkins map with, dots on counties and the size of dots, right? And in terms of amount of outbreak, that was one of the ones I believe that you shared with us. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about why that may be slightly misleading from the perspective of what is it really telling us?
Yeah, so here's that map, Darryl, and this one's received over 1 billion hits. It's getting some pretty heavy duty use. And so I was looking like right here, almost dead center of the map at the Middle East, and I started scrolling in going, I wonder how this is affecting old Saudi Arabia here. Wait, what? The symbol isn't changing necessarily scalar in the right direction with my scroll, and I've only got one. Whereas if I come over and I'm looking at China here and I start coming in, the data start to disaggregate. Well, okay, they're not doing that now. They were in the prior version. And in the US, it looks like they've changed that to where they're now just showing, well, here in the US, it definitely is disaggregating, right? We're showing it as almost, it looks like dots that are the center of some kind of a raster overlay or centroids here. So there's another issue when I look at this is like, wait, how is the placement of the dots getting done here? And they're only have 5 or 7 different size symbols here, and trying to capture this enormous scale and then break it into 5 classes. And so you could have, say, 500 cases in the smallest scale. And I couldn't find a legend here, by the way, when I was playing around with it. But and then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you might have 10,000 cases. Well, 500 cases in rural Mississippi in the smallest dot is a really big deal, right? Especially if you're thinking about that on a rate basis. But that 10,000 cases, okay, that's also a big deal in New York. But in that metro area is 10, 12 million people. On a rate basis, maybe it's not quite as concerning. So how we choose to do the breaks in our data, a lot of times, as a geospatial guy, I just go with whatever the defaults that Esri has thrown at me. Jenks breaks, great, good, and that's what we do. And again, is it how we practice? Is it intentional cognitive bias, or is it unintentional cognitive bias in terms of how we're seeing or visualizing the data, absent the inputs that we need to be listening to from the quote professionals, or just what's going on here? I think it's really hard, and so. There's this cognitive bias thing. I think there's a little, we tend to do a little Dunning-Kruger here, frankly, as GIS people. We're smart, right? So we think we can figure it out and choose the appropriate thing. One of my favorite articles that I beat my students up with all the time is, the death of expertise. We really got to stop and listen to the experts instead of going with what our gut says or what the defaults are in software. And again, on the other side of the fence, as users, there's critical thinking that's got to go on to help reduce some of the cognitive bias when they see and read a map like that too. Oh, look, it's a small dot. It's not a big deal. Wait, they have to think about it a little bit more to make sure that the correct impressions are being received, right? That's what cartography is all about. It's the sender and the receiver of a message in a spatial context.
So I love the way you talked about that just now, the sender and receiver of information, right? So at the beginning of our conversation, one of the things that you said was it depends on who the audience is. So if we think about what we're faced with, we have nightly briefings from the president's task force. Sometimes maps are shown, and sometimes it's amount of equipment, whether it's respirators or masks or swabs or testing kits, whatever that might look like. And locations are often shown. It might be numbers of beds. It could be numbers of tests performed. It could be per capita infections reported. It could be per capita infections confirmed. It could be per capita deaths, right? And so all of those things are part of the discussion, and exactly what is the message that's being sent. I'm curious from your perspective, with all that kind of stew, and every one of those things happens at a different time scale and throughout the week. All you have to do is just look at the weekly briefings. But from your perspective, I want to talk a little bit about, if you were advising Congress, what maps would you present to them so they could actually start making the decisions they make based on spatial information, not simply here's what's going on from either a policy perspective or here's what I'm hearing from my constituents and my, what do you tell them? Because this is not just, COVID is not confined to one state. COVID is not confined to one country. So what information would you like to be able to show them on a map?
Yeah, I think the first conversation we have, Darryl, is actually not about the map itself. We'll talk about that in a second, but rather about the underlying inconsistency and lack of standardization, lack of centralized kind of control on how the data is being collected. In the emergency response community, we're really big on standards, right? I can take my fire truck here from rural Cleveland, Mississippi, drive up there to the National Capital Region where you're at, Reston, and I can take a hose off it and connect to the fire hydrant in front of your house. That's because we have standards for hose threads. We have standards for all kinds of stuff, radio systems and, the turnout gear that we wear, the medical practices that we apply to a problem. In the geospatial world, though, there's standards, but they're just not as pervasive as we find in the disaster management community. And I think this extends over into the data mess that we have right now. There is very little centralized effort in terms of putting out instructions on, okay, this is the information you need to be collecting and how it should be collected so that we can build this aggregate picture. There's nobody driving the bus, right, in terms of that data piece. So the first thing I'd say is, hey guys, whisper in the president's ear, get some legislation going, something here so that we can get the information we need to depict things, because it leads to the next thing then. And I'll share my screen again here. You ask, okay, what would I make? Well, okay, I'll show you what I'd make. It's not necessarily very good or the right thing though. Here it is. This is COVID in Mississippi as of this last Sunday. And the way that I approached it was, okay, I'm going to use the red because this is, by all accounts, a massive public health disaster. We're closing down businesses. People are losing their jobs. If government is willing to do that to our economy and interfere with personal freedoms that much, this is a pretty big deal. That's the message I'm getting from government. And what informs me is the cartographer in terms of at least choosing color and things like that. Then the next thing I said is, okay, what do they really need to know? We're seeing a lot of information about number of cases, and we've kind of had this discussion already about per capita. 10 cases in Bolivar County with a population total of 38,000 means a very different thing than 10 cases in Reston, Virginia. The population sizes, the quality and quantity of resources available to deal with those cases are very, very different animals. And so to me, the number of cases is meaningless without some type of context. And the only way to kind of provide a picture across a larger geographic area then is to provide the information as per capita. So what is the rate per capita? And so that's actually the first layer of data that's on this map. It's the second in the legend. I said, I want to show some other things. So how do I put multiple pieces of information together in one? And this is the strength of GIS, right? So I showed that rate data as a dot density layer over each county. Now, this creates another problem, though, and it's again, this comes back to cognitive bias. People look at this really quick. They may not be familiar with cartography, and they're going, "Holy smokes, Talbot! You're showing the exact location of where cases are. That's violating, healthcare confidentiality rules." And I'm like, no, that's not how this works. This is just number of dots randomized within a county, but oops, right? That's something I didn't think about as I started putting this together. That's my own cognitive bias going, oh, I know how to do this. No, maybe I don't, right? The next piece was then, in terms of providing that big picture message, are we really concerned with the number of cases or the rate? Yeah, but we're more concerned with, what's the message we hear? Flatten the curve. So what is the rate of change going on? So I looked at the rate of change from the Sunday prior and the week before that, and I'm simply compared that to get the background choropleth layer, showing, oh, geez, in these counties that are in the deepest, brightest reds, we have at least a doubling in the last 7 days. That's insane, right? And somebody said, well, you could start with this Sequina County over here that has 0 cases, and then, it's only got a population of 1,300 people. So if it only got 3 cases, it's only 3 cases. Come on, is it a big deal? And I'm going, yeah, if you go from 0 to 3 in a place with only 1,300 people, that could be a really big deal, right? So how did I bring that forward is then I used the GetSGI or STAR hotspot analysis tool and said, okay, let's use some spatial statistics here, the null hypothesis, and get some confidence intervals going. And so where are my hotspots? And then I did that analysis and outlined the 3 counties that where the confidence interval was greater than 95%, because they are spatial hotspots. And it doesn't just mean the county itself, right? When you start doing that type of analysis, it's taking into account neighbors, right? So it's these counties and the surrounding areas have these higher than expected or higher than modeled growth rate in the number of cases per capita. Right. And then lastly, the last piece of information, and I'll try to zoom in a little, is trying to present the information in kind of a different way, so that you can accommodate different types of users, right? In the classroom, we always focus on trying to accommodate different types of learners. Some are learn by reading, some learn by seeing, by doing, and it's the same when we're trying to convey that message to an audience using a cartographic product. The map is hopefully pretty effective, but backstopping yourself with graphs and figures is another way to do it. So I'm showing the weekly rate of increase on the y-axis here, and each of the weeks that I have data for, and I fit a curve to it, because again, we're hearing the flatten the curve, and people can see, well, doesn't look like that curve is necessarily going flat here when I look at the information like this, and that line is extended out to a predicted value for this coming, end of week. So this is my first stab, but there's all kinds of stuff that I don't know. And I need to find an epidemiologist or somebody who can better inform how I might model the neighborhood relationships when I use the hotspot analysis tool, or even if that is really the most appropriate tool to do kind of a heat map or hotspot analysis. I don't know. I'm just the geospatial guy. And so I would love to be able to connect up with that expert. And it circles back then to all these different types of cognitive bias. I don't know what I don't know,
Yeah, so there are so many pieces of great discussion fodder there that would literally everyone would take an hour. I just want to touch on a couple things, right? So you showed a number of ways to be able to look at things that are effectively normalized for per capita, like how many people and relationships between how many people. Now, the one part that has me concerned as we go into a let's open up the country kind of posture over the next month or two, and we've got several states that are already in setting that in motion for this coming Monday. How do we ensure that we account for the underprivileged populations? And I'm going to say that specifically from an economic standpoint, right? So one thing that's not on your map, there are two things that weren't on the map, right? Where are the healthcare locations and transportation corridors, right? So those are two things that are fairly, I mean, we know where they are, that we can get access to that information and those data. But what do they really mean as we get further in? Because, I've watched interview after interview with mayors that have large underserved populations. And, one of the CDC's going forward plans right now is to monitor closely all the prisons as potential canaries in the coal mine. So if a prison flare up happens, then we should send some sort of response team to that location. Here's a question: if you're not in a prison, but you're in an underserved population that doesn't have a good access to healthcare, how do we access information about the level of infection there? Because that's where the most vulnerable population is, right? So there's nothing we can do with a map to fix that, but how would you recommend that we at least show where those underserved populations are from a health standpoint? HHS data, or what is it that you would recommend? I mean, for our listeners, before we have Talbot answer that. Talbot also served for multiple years on the NGAC, the National Geospatial Advisory Council, and then they helped set a lot of the standards and help recommend policy improvements of how we do our mapping in the U.S. So Talbot comes at this from a lot of different directions. So with that context, Talbot, what do you think about the underserved populations?
Yeah, so we do have some pretty good standards in terms of how that data has been collected, right? Tim Traynor, when he was at Census, really did a lot to advance how we collect and maintain the census data from a demographic perspective, and so I think that part of the equation is there. But then it comes back to, again, the issue we're confronted with COVID is, okay, how far is testing penetrated into the community? Is anybody bothering to ask or collect the demographics, or is it just they came back hot on the test or they didn't? We don't have a granularity or a standardization to the data, how it's being collected, where it's being collected, to really make any decent decisions. So again, back to beating the drum up front is, look, we know that we can create a spatial product that might be a guide to where we need to go get information. And the analogy I'd have here is like, when I was making a map of cell phone tower locations that were receiving calls during Hurricane Katrina, I wish I had it here to share. I was mapping all these towers as they came back online and using some proportional symbols to show how many calls they were handling. And in a certain area of the map, there was a blank spot. And I was like, uh-oh, the blank spot where we don't have information tells us a lot more than where we have information, right? Because my hypothesis for the blank spot then becomes either everybody's dead or there's no cell phone towers there, right? Those are about the only two options. And so we were asking the question, where a cell phone service, who has it? it's got to go a step further, right? What does the absence of data actually mean? And I think that's part of the case here with underserved and minority communities, where are we lacking the data in proportion to the collection rate in other areas, and then guide a concentrated effort to go out and get that information. So that's part one. And then part two, as you've astutely pointed out, is, okay, how do we start tailoring this map to the deficiencies or the challenges in the infrastructure associated with supporting those populations? Because, they're people too, right? We have a social responsibility to ensure they're cared for, as well as and have access to care as well as anybody else. Now, it begs a second question then, Darryl, is your first kind of foray into what my opinion was, okay, you got to give Congress a national picture, but now you're starting to ask more specialized questions, and who might ask them, and the audience that I have got to transmit that information to changes, right? As a geospatial person, as a cartographer, there's only so many layers you can get onto a map before it starts getting clustered. So do we have to change mediums? Do I make some kind of a story map where you can scroll or turn layers on and off? Or do I have to create a series of PDFs, right, to put physically into their hands, because that has a very different impact on a policymaker. When you put a printed map in their hand that they can kind of stare of, they'll tend to spend more time with it than they do something on the screen. I think maybe that's a generational thing based on who's in office, but understanding that is really important. So we've got to again interpret the relative importance and the message to the audience and understand one size doesn't fit all.
Just to pipe in real quick, you actually reminded me of an interesting use case when you're talking about the absence of data, and it relates, but I want to just bring some just another perspective into understanding the value of that. And this image that I'm about to share is it's been floating around the internet a little while, but it's one of my favorite to show the example of what you're talking about. And you probably have seen it before.
Yeah.
So this relates to improving aircraft that came out of World War II, and aircraft were shot up like crazy, and and they were looking at the bullet holes and thinking like, oh, well, obviously where these bullet holes are, we need to increase armor, and well, actually, where there's not bullet holes is where we need to focus, because we actually have an absence of aircraft because they likely got shot down because the ones that got shot in those areas didn't come back.
Didn't make it back. Yeah.
So, sorry. I know it's a little bit of an anecdote story, but I think it's a great relationship between understanding why it's so important to look at the absence of data just as much as it is where there is density. And just because you don't see anything there doesn't mean it's not important.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Well, Talbot, listen, we're coming up on the end of our time together here. Love to be able to, have additional conversations about lots of chunks of topics. But, for our listeners, can you kind of just give us if you're going to go out and talk about a topic, what would you recommend as a first step? Just, we're rehashing a little bit, but tell us what you think about how you start the process of telling stories with a map.
Yeah, so I think there's another part, actually, Darryl, and I hate to introduce new information when we're trying to do a summation, but it's also, and one of the, people have asked, how come I haven't put that map on the Delta State website, for example, right? Why have, I've thrown it up on Facebook as kind of a bitch session, but not pushed it anywhere else. And the reason is, I want to make sure that I'm part of the system, right? When you're working with disaster and emergency response, being an integrated part of the system is important. Otherwise, the actions that you take tend to be really disruptive and can add more confusion to the issue than help. And as geospatial folks, there are so many good, kind-hearted folks willing to donate tons of time, but make it count, make it be part of the system rather than working from outside and creating some kind of chaos. Then my next point is, okay, let's get some consensus and some leadership going on the collection of data. Where is it going to get reported to? How is it going to be accessed? What are the standards going to be? What does each attribute mean? And how are we going to present this information? What are the presentation standards? Let's have a conversation about that. And I think that needs to be part of any COVID task forces. Is the public information officer or whomever needs to kind of take charge of that component. What is the message that we're trying to send, and who are we trying to send it to? So that we can, as geospatial professionals, at least control for our own cognitive bias a little bit more. That's another thing that standards and standardizing presentations does, is it helps remove some of our own cognitive biases. And then I think the last piece of this equation is learn how to segment the information so that it's reaching the appropriate audience at the right time, right? And that's key too, right? And again, those are kind of some leadership types of things that are needed in the crisis right now. It's great to try to have a daily press briefing and talk to the entire country, but that's not necessarily the most effective way of reaching out and getting the message that certain audiences need to hear. Did we lose Darryl?
No, I am still here.
Oh, very still.
Yeah, it's like
pensive.
Yeah, so Talbot and I have had a lot of conversations over time. When he sees me actually not speaking, he gets really worried, and I actually tell him, I do occasionally think before I speak.
He's actually nodded off more often than anything else. But
yeah, it's probably true. Now I'm wide awake, man. I'm good. Listen, it's been great talking to you, and one of the things that we can do is after the fact is if there are some additional calls to action that you want to be able to encourage folks, if people want to come in and do some crowdsource map creation, for example, maybe there are some links that we can throw up there. But we want to thank you for your time and hang in there in the aftermath of multiple tornadoes and flood events. On top of COVID, and luckily you're not dealing, at least right now, with the locusts in East Africa.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
we are watching for the four horsemen. I would pass to the audience too. I think professional development is an important piece of the pie here. You do geospatial, and we have a commitment to always be learning about this. And I'll blow our own horn now. We've got over 30 online courses available through Delta State on everything from cartography to spatial statistics. And I'd welcome any members of the audience to take a class or, grab the degree or whatever. More information is available at deltastate.edu, or just search GIS and Delta State, and you'll find your way to the programs that we offer.
That's great, Talbot, and I want to leave you with one last question too before we pop off. I know Darryl's been doing a lot of questions, and the one thing I wanted to bring up is, how do you think the current crisis will improve the standards that you mentioned that are just not there? And one thing I wanted to highlight with that is a lot of these problems existed before this. I know we didn't have, we focused on we obviously had the flu that's been going around, and we had a number of other diseases, but they didn't make as much of an impact as they are now. So we always had this problem with tracking health data around the country, but it's just taken a crisis to realize how bad we needed something like this. So do you think the current crisis will improve the situation and even convert those best practices over existing regular diseases that float around every day?
No. I say somewhat tongue in cheek and with great pain. You know how we get a new standard in the fire service, right? Kill a firefighter. Because very often that's what it takes. Is there's got to be some type of huge consequence. So coming out of COVID, here, until our maps kill somebody, I doubt it. Right? This is going to be kind of scattershot, or people start recognizing there's a lot of bad geospatial information floating around. We need to do better with this. So a lot of the lessons learned in how we approach geospatial and things like search and rescue came out of congressional investigation on Katrina, right? You can read that report and it calls out a lot of stuff. And that was really, really useful to our community. We need something like that to happen here as kind of an after action report, not for the sake of finding fault or finding blame, but rather identifying strengths and weaknesses and leveraging them to create those standardized approaches. I would love to see more coursework available in geospatial technologies for public health. I mean, it's not saying that they're not there right now. I'm sure they are. But we haven't had the incidents or that trigger mechanism to raise things to that level of, oh, geez, everybody has to do this, right? Or we have to standardize, circle the wagons type of things. So, in terms of where we are today, no, it may be 2 years from now. I certainly hope so.
All right. Well, once again, Talbot, thank you for joining us today, and I appreciate it. We had a lot of technical issues, and Darryl for really, your familiarity and relationship with Darryl goes a long way, and helping this be a really interactive conversation with your experience. A lot of technical issues. So for those watching, this is going to be an interesting aftermath from an editing standpoint. So you're going to watch me work some massive magic here. So probably more than I've ever done before, over 200 episodes. So we'll see what happens. Darryl, do you have any last minute words, or we're going to wrap this one up?
Yeah, let's we can wrap it. I also wanted to thank again Talbot and thank you for your 4 dogs being quiet. That's very cool. Yeah, they're all at his feet. You can't see it, but they're all there hanging out. And we started the episode off by having the UPS guy come in, and the dogs were going nuts. That was pretty funny. So thank them for us after we're off the air.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks a lot, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.